All right. Okay, ready? So first, at the very top, a conditional statement is what you're going to write. If I can get my pen to write, would it help? Okay, a conditional statement is a compound statement that consists of a hypothesis and what comes with a hypothesis? In science, when you make a hypothesis, then you draw a conclusion. Yep. Okay, so a conditional statement is a compound statement that consists of two parts. It consists of the hypothesis and of the conclusion. And that conclusion is false only when its hypothesis is true and the conditional statement is false when the hypothesis is true, but the conclusion is false. And we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. How to determine if it's true or false, and then what to do from there. Okay, so we have our conditional statement, which is our original statement. It is a compound statement, and it is always going to be, or most of the time, going to be written in what we call if-then form. If-then form. And then a lot of the times you'll see them use some variables to represent our hypothesis and the conclusion. So that conditional statement is in the form of if P, where P represents my hypothesis, then Q, and Q is the conclusion. Okay, if P, then Q. If the hypothesis, then the conclusion. Now, the next one is telling us which part is which. So up there, what came after if? The hypothesis or the conclusion? I put if P. What did I tell you P was? The hypothesis. So the hypothesis of the statement... Oh, it would help if this would work. Okay, the hypothesis of the statement is always going to be right after the word if. If, I don't know, it's raining outside, okay? And then what part came after then up there? Then Q, what did I tell you Q was? The conclusion. So the conclusion sorry, my pen is just not wanting to write at all. The conclusion, that's very messy, sorry, is the statement that comes directly after the word then. So if the hypothesis, then the conclusion. And it's important that you know that because we are going to write some related conditional statements based off of the hypothesis and the conclusion. Everybody ready? The first related sentence that we are going to write after our conditional is given to us is called the converse, not the shoes, okay? The converse of my conditional statement is formed by interchanging or exchanging the hypothesis and the conclusion. Basically, you switch them around. I'm sorry, y'all. This is really messy, and I'm trying to write it, but it is just not wanting to write very well. Okay, so the converse is formed by switching out the hypothesis and the conclusion. Yeah. Then we're going to write the inverse. The inverse of a conditional statement is formed by doing what we call negating both the hypothesis and the conclusion. So if I say I am going to do something, to negate that would be to say I'm not going to do that, right? Or to say something is blue, to negate it would say it is not blue. And then what we call the contrapositive is formed by switching, that means changing places, and negating the hypothesis and the conclusion. Okay, so you have your conditional statement. That's the original one that's going to be given to you. And that is going to be in the form of if P, then Q. Remember, P is my hypothesis, Q is my conclusion. Then we are going to write the converse, which is basically just going to take the P and the Q and switch them. So it will say if Q, then P. So you just like switch them out, right? Sure. Then we're going to write the inverse, which goes back to the original, and it says we negate the hypothesis and the conclusion. So it would say if not P, then not Q. And then we have our converse. Nope, I'm just kidding. We already did converse. I meant our contrapositive, sorry. Which is going to the original, switching and negating. So it's going to be if not Q, then not P. Okay. And we'll, again, look at what that looks like in words here in a little bit. But this is just getting us set up. You have to know these. On your quiz next week, I will give you a conditional statement. I'm going to say, is that statement true or false? And then I'm going to tell you to write the converse. And then I'm going to say, is the converse true or false? And then I'm going to tell you to write the inverse. And is the inverse true or false? And then I'm going to tell you to write the contrapositive. And then is that true or false? So you will have several different questions off of one sentence. If you mix them up, then that's not a great start to your quiz, right? So we've got to make sure we remember this stuff. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to identify our hypothesis and our conclusion. So what it says is underline the hypothesis once and the conclusion twice. Is everybody ready? We'll do the first couple together, then I'll let you try. So the first example says, if a polygon has 6 sides, then it is a hexagon. We said the hypothesis comes after the word if. So everything after the if is going to get underlined once up until I get to my comma. So that's my hypothesis. A polygon has 6 sides. And then we said that our conclusion comes after what word? Then. And so what's after then here? It is a hexagon. So I'm going to underline that twice because it tells me underline the hypothesis once and the conclusion twice. Does that make a little bit of sense? Okay, do the next one, do B. If the first performance is sold out, then another one will be scheduled. Supposed to say another one will be scheduled, not another on will be scheduled. Underline your hypothesis once, your conclusion twice. Again, your hypothesis comes after if, your conclusion comes after then. What was that? Somebody's pencil? Okay. All right, what's my hypothesis here? What comes after if? The first performance is sold out, so that gets underlined once. And then my conclusion is after then, which is? Another one will be scheduled. See how it's not hard, right? Underlining. All right, go ahead and do C and D if you have not already. Hypothesis once, conclusion twice. Underline the hypothesis once, your conclusion twice on both C and D. What's my hypothesis for C? The forecast is rain, so that gets underlined once. And then my conclusion is? I will take an umbrella. Okay. And then for D, if what? Then it is. There you go. Okay. That's not hard stuff, right? So in your homework, I believe that's the first thing you'll have to do is underline the hypothesis and the conclusion. All right. Flip it over. Okay, these are written in a little bit of a different form. It's asking us to identify the hypothesis and the conclusion, but it's not written in an if-then form, so we're going to have to change it. Some of these you can go either way. Some of them you have to just be very careful with. So what does A say? It says 4 quarters can be exchanged for a dollar bill, right? So we need to be able to write that in if-then form. So if I have, maybe, what's it talking about at the beginning? 4 quarters. So if I have 4 quarters, right? Then what could you say? If I have, or you have, or whatever, it doesn't have to be word for word, 4 quarters, then I can exchange them for a $1 bill. And then once you write it in if-then form, then you can go back, underline your hypothesis once, your conclusion twice. What's my hypothesis here? And then my conclusion would be? There you go. One looks a little messy, but you get the idea. Okay, now the next one says the sum of the measures of 2 supplementary angles is 180 degrees. So this is one where it would make more sense if we kind of think about it a little bit backwards. What does it say about the angles that they have to be? But before 180? Supplementary, right? And if they are supplementary, then they will have a what? They will be have a sum of 180, right? Okay. So technically, you could do it 2 different ways. So you could say if the sum of the measures of 2 angles is 180, then they are supplementary. Or you could say if two angles are supplementary, then their sum is 180. That one's a little less. And this one, it really doesn't matter which way you go. So I'm going to write it like this. If two angles, because it's less writing, are supplementary, then their sum is 180 degrees. Okay. Again, that one could go either way. You could say if two angles sum is 180, then they are supplementary. Or if two angles are supplementary, then their sum is 180. So a lot of these you can do both. And then what would the hypothesis be the way it's written? If what? Yep. Whoa. I did not go there. And then my conclusion would be that their sum is, there you go. All right, everybody ready? You'll have to do that a little bit on your homework too. Change them into if-then form and then identify your hypothesis and conclusion. Now we're going to practice writing those statements up there. So we're going to look at our original statement. This is my conditional statement. It says, if it is Saturday, then there is no school. The first thing I want you to decide, is that true or false? If it is Saturday, then there is no school. True or false? True, right? So go ahead and circle true for that one. Okay, let me ask you this. Before we start trying to write our sentences, what is my hypothesis? It is Saturday. And my conclusion is there is no school. Okay, so that's my hypothesis, P. That's my conclusion, Q. So we're going to write the converse first. So what does the converse say that I do with my P and my Q? I just switch them, right? So this is what we do. We're going to say if. I write my conclusion. If there is no school, okay, then I put my hypothesis, which was it is Saturday. Okay, so all I did was I switched my hypothesis and the conclusion for the converse. Forever. Is that true or false? That's false. Okay, because if there is no school, it could also be what day? Sunday. Yeah. Now we're going to write the inverse. Okay. So the inverse goes back to my original statement, and I negate both the hypothesis and the conclusion. So if not P, so let's talk about that. My hypothesis says it is Saturday. So to negate that, I would say it is not Saturday. So if it is not Saturday, then I negate the conclusion as well. The conclusion says there is no school. So how would I negate that? Then there is school. Okay, so my inverse is taking the original statement and negating the hypothesis and the conclusion. So if it is not Saturday, then there is no school. Would that be true or false? False, okay, because again, it could be what day? Sunday. See what I mean about you're going to think you're in English? We have to write sentences. That's what we're doing. We'll do that for a few days. Then the contrapositive. So the contrapositive takes my original one. It switches and negates. So we're going to say if not my conclusion, then not my hypothesis. Okay. If there is school, yep, then it is not Saturday. That is correct. And would that be true or false? That's true. If there is school, it's not going to be a Saturday, right? Do we get the idea? Because I want to let you try one by yourself and see how well we do. All right, so here is your conditional statement. If the product of two numbers is odd, then the both numbers must be odd. I want you to take a minute and I want you to write the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive. Okay. So we should be writing the converse, which switches the hypothesis and the conclusion, the inverse, which negates the hypothesis and the conclusion, and the contrapositive, which switches and negates. Converse switches the hypothesis and the conclusion. The inverse negates the hypothesis and the conclusion. These are all from the original statement. And then the contrapositive switches and negates. It might help you to make sure you underline the hypothesis once and the conclusion twice so that you know what the parts are to switch. Remember, P represents hypothesis, Q represents conclusion. My hypothesis is the product of two numbers is odd, correct? Okay. My conclusion is both numbers must be odd. So for the converse, I basically switch that around. Oh, hold on. Let's do that. Is that true? Oh, I'm going to sneeze. Sorry. You said it's false? Can you give me an example of two odd numbers being multiplied that is not odd? But it's talking about odd, not positive or negative. Like if I do 1 times 3, that's 3, right? Or 5 times 3 is 15, or 3 times 7 is 21. It seems that they're always going to be odd, right? Okay, so that's going to be true. So for the converse, I'm going to switch it. So if both numbers are odd, you see how I can change a word here and there to make it make sense when you're writing it? So if both numbers are odd, then their product is odd. Do you see how I just switched those two around? Is that going to be true or false? True. And then for the inverse, I go back to the original statement and I negate it. So if the product of two numbers is not odd, I'm going to abbreviate. Then both numbers must what? Not be odd. And that is also true. And then the contrapositive is going to switch and negate. So if both numbers are not odd, and again, these don't have to be word for word as long as they say you're switching the hypothesis and I can understand what you're talking about. So if both numbers are not odd, then their product is not odd, right? Didn't I negate that? Switch and negate? Yes? Is everybody okay with that? Is that true or false? True. So you just have to get into the idea of going from the original, you switch for the converse. And then for the inverse, you just take the original and you negate it. And then for the contrapositive, you switch and negate. Does that make a little bit of sense? Okay. I'm not going to make you do that last one on here because I feel like you've written a couple